Now, who is Russ Cohen? Now, he has a book I urge you all to look at. It's called Wild Plants I Have Known and Eaten. He does many walks for many agencies. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce this man who we're looking forward to what he has to say about edible plants.
Okay. It's great to be here tonight, and thank you for that introduction. As was mentioned, I like to mostly teach people outside and show you the actual plants. This is kind of a substitute. This is like a virtual foraging tour that we're going to do today. Okay, this plant is looking like this right now. This is burdock, the plant with the round burrs that get caught in your socks. And the guy who invented Velcro did get the idea from these burrs, by the way. And it's a wonderfully edible plant and nutritious, not that stage. But just about the rest of the plant is edible, so let me tell you about that. So, in fact, I gave you a recipe I'll get to in a second. But this is one stage of the plant. This is when the plant's at a rosette stage and it's sending down this big taproot. And by the way, if you think that's rhubarb, the way to tell it apart is that the petioles, the stalks that go down into the plant, they're going to be green streaked with purple, and they have ridges on them like a little celery stick. Whereas rhubarb stalks are smooth and red, so that's one way to tell them apart. But anyway, one part that's edible on a burdock is the root. The plant's a biennial, so you want to harvest the root like in the latter half of the first year, the very beginning of the second year, because by the time the plant produces a flower stalk, the root's going to get way too woody to eat. So this is a stage where you could eat the root, but unfortunately you can't grab the foliage and yank on it and get the root out that way. It will break on you, so you have to dig them up, which is a lot of work, so I don't usually bother. Once you've done that, you can eat it on the spot, or you can throw it into spaghetti sauce. It's really good that way. Or one good way to use it is in the recipe I gave you, which is just an adaptation of the recipe that I'm sure a lot of you have eaten if you haven't made it yourself. It's a recipe where you take artichoke hearts, Parmesan cheese, breadcrumbs, and mayonnaise, and you mix it together and you bake it in the oven, and it's a spread that you put on crackers. Well, you can substitute the boiled burdock flower stalk rounds for the artichoke hearts in that recipe. It works great. If you did it, you'd have this large beige root which you could wash off, and one way to cook it is just slice it crosswise in half-inch thick rounds and boil it in salted water till it's tender, about 15 minutes, and then it tastes like a starchy artichoke. But as I said, I'm too lazy to do that, so instead I wait till the following year in like the first, second week of June, and I'm going for the developing flower stalk, and that's that center stalk right there. When it's about a foot and a half tall, I'm cutting it ground level, lopping off the top cluster leaves, so I've got a length of stalk about that long. Now the very outer layer of a burdock is stringy and bitter, so you have to trim that part off. But it's not hollow inside, it's solid, and once you get the outer part off, you basically have this elongated artichoke heart, which you can chop that up crosswise and boil it in salted water until it's tender, and that's only about 4 or 5 minutes. One last thing about this plant. For years and years, and as you heard, I've been teaching foraging for over 3 decades now. From time to time on one of my walks, when we get to this plant, somebody would speak up and say, my Sicilian grandmother would, and then they tell me this story. And over the years, I began to hear the story over and over again and noticed it was pretty similar. So I thought, okay, there's got to be something to this. And the story was that the Sicilian grandmothers would cook the petioles of the burdock, which are the leaf stalks right there that the leaves are attached to, and harvest them this time of year, or maybe earlier would be even better, and cut them into like 2 or 3 inch lengths, boil them in water till they're tender, which is 4 or 5 minutes, and then they would coat them into a beaten egg and then roll them around in some breadcrumbs, and then fry them in a skillet with a little olive oil and kind of mash them down and make a little patty out of it, and then fry it on both sides till it's brown. And everybody who told me the story said, oh, it's really good, you have to try it. So this year, I finally tried it, and it is good, so that's another way to eat the burdock. Okay, now we're going to range a little further afield here, because this is an Edible Wild Plants and Mushrooms of New England show. So this slide is from the Berkshires. It's not anywhere around here, because this is a plant that likes the sweeter soil that we don't really have here in eastern Mass. This is the wild leek, and you might know it as ramps. And this is a plant that's getting very hot now in the celebrity chefs crow about using this plant, and it's showing up in some of the produce markets now. I'm very ambivalent about that, because I'm great that people are celebrating wild foods and a local native species and stuff, but I'm worried this plant's going to get depleted, because what people tend to do when they harvest it is they dig the whole thing up. I've been to patches like that where I've seen them nuked by chefs going out to gather raw materials for their diners, and that's bad news. And it's unnecessary, because this is a close-up of what a wild leek looks like. Now, each one of these plants has an edible bulb at the base, but the leaves are edible. They're like scallions. They have a great flavor. And each plant produces 2 or 3 leaves. So if you pick 1 leaf per plant, that's a totally sustainable level of harvest. You're not killing the plant at all. You get the wonderful wild leek flavor. And that plant will always be there for you to go back and harvest from, or anybody else. So that's what if you want to dig up a couple bulbs, I'm not going to, be mad at you or anything, but see if you can get by with, harvesting just leaves off some of the plants too. And that will help ensure they'll be around for the future. Okay, this is another native species that you have to dig up to harvest, and so you have to be circumspect about it. This one does grow in eastern Mass and sometimes in large colonies. This is called an Indian cucumber. So this is my wife Ellen, and she's holding up 2 of the plants. If you see at the bottom, that's the edible part, the little root, and it tastes like a starchy cucumber, and they're really good. But you kill the plant to harvest it this way. So you have to be sure that there's a lot of the plant around before you pick any. So I'm looking for dozens of the plants before I'm thinking of digging up any. But I have seen places in New England where there are untold hundreds if not thousands of these plants, and then if you want to dig up a few, it's not a big deal. There's another thing to worry about with this plant though. There is a rare orchid that looks like this plant that you don't want to pick by mistake. So can you go back? The name of the rare orchid is the small whorled begonia, and it is a listed species, so you don't want to pick that one by mistake. The botanical name for Indian cucumber is Mediola virginiana. The botanical name for the small whorled begonia is Isotria medieloides, which means looks like Indian cucumber. So, how do you tell them apart? Well, if you look carefully on these larger Indian cucumber plants, you'll see they have a double-decker effect. As you have one whorl of leaves, and then you have another little stalk, and then you have a second whorl of leaves where the little flowers form and where the little berries form. The small whorl begonia doesn't do that. It has its flowers come out of the top of the single whorl. So if you're just harvesting the double-decker Indian cucumber plants, you'll never pick the small whorl begonia by mistake. And you want to harvest the double-decker plants anyway because those have the bigger roots. All right, another native species. This one's quite common. I know it grows in Newton. This is the catbrier, the bullbrier, the greenbrier. This is Smilax rotundifolia. This time of year, it's not edible. It's just a nuisance to bushwhack through. And this is a plant that I grew up calling it thorns as a kid because that's its most prominent feature. And it is edible. In the spring into the summer, if you look at the end of the vine, you see this tender growing tip. And the whole thing is nice and soft and flexible. You can just snap it off with your fingers, pop it right in your mouth. Even if there's a little thorn on there, you can push it right in with your fingers and just eat it right up. So you can do that, but there's actually a cousin of this plant in the same genus that I like even more. And this is a plant called carrion flower. This is Smilax herbacea or herbacea. It's a thornless herbaceous cousin of the greenbrier. And it looks a lot like asparagus. It's actually related to asparagus. It grows straight up like that in the spring. And then you snap off the top like 8 inches or so, which isn't killing the plant because it's got ancillary buds that will sprout out from the sides. And then you steam it like asparagus, you eat it like asparagus. It tastes like asparagus. It's related to asparagus. It's really good. And occasionally you can find, good supplies of it. It's not that common in native species, but there are patches like that where you can find that many in eastern Mass. So here I've steamed up some, and I'm going to add it to an omelet. If you look really carefully, you can see some little spherical flower buds beginning to form on these shoots. If I'd waited just a little bit longer until those things were blooming, I wouldn't want to be near this plant because it smells like dirty gym socks or rotten meat. That's why it's called carrion flower, because it's really putrid smell. So, but before it blooms, it's delicious. This is a plant called pineapple weed, and it loves to grow in really bad gravelly soil. That's where to look for it. Those are the flowers. They never develop petals. It's a cousin of chamomile, so you use it the same way. You make a tea from it, but it's called pineapple weed because the tea tastes like canned pineapple. And the flavor is most pronounced in the flowers, but actually the whole plant has that flavor. Very common garden weed called lamb's quarters. It is a wild spinach. It has more vitamins than spinach. The white dust that you see in the center of each plant, that's a natural mealiness that the plant produces. It's not from a road or anything like that. So that's one way to identify the plant. And this is a good stage to harvest it when the plants are coming up. And this is in early June. And I'll just snap off the roots and you can eat the plant raw, or you can steam it and eat it. You don't have to boil it. And this is also a really good ingredient in the spanakopita, the spinach pie. Cattail, there's a whole chapter on cattails in my book, so I won't go into any detail about that. I'll just mention a couple things. Here the cattail flowers are blooming, and so you have the pollen which you can collect, and you can mix it with flour to make things like these beautiful cattail pollen muffins. You can make crepes or cookies or other baked goods with the cattail pollen. Immature cattail flowers you can boil up and eat. Here I'm demonstrating to a group the center of the developing cattail shoot, which is the cattail heart, and that tastes a lot like a cucumber, and you can use it the same way. You could chop it up, put it into salads. This is wild rice. This is what it looks like, and it does grow in eastern Massachusetts, so you could harvest it if you wanted to. I never have. I do what you do. I go to the store and buy it. Well, actually what I do is I order it from the Indian tribe in Minnesota, and they still collect it the traditional way. They go out in their canoes in the lakes, and they bend the plants over, and they knock the grains loose into the boat, and then they have to parch them and winnow them, which is why I've never bothered to make it myself, because there's some labor involved. So I buy it and use it. But anyway, but you could do it. You could collect your own if you wanted to in Massachusetts. This plant grows right in front of the library here. Very, very common plant in eastern Mass. This is the black locust. It's in that invasive species book. And that's the edible part, the flowers. And they look like that for only about a 2-week period around Memorial Day. And that's it. That's the only time to get them. That's the thing about foraging. Foraging really brings you back to the whole seasonality of food that we've lost when we've been able to go to the store and get any ingredient any day of the year. With wild things, you've got to pay very close attention to the seasons, the calendar and stuff, so you don't miss your opportunity to get things. In my book, I've got a spreadsheet which tells you when to pick stuff in the Boston area, so it saves you a tremendous amount of guesswork. So if you look up that book, you'll see that for black locust, you're looking like the last 2 weeks in May. These flowers have a really sweet jasmine-like smell, and they're great for stuffing your face right by the tree, or picking the blossoms off the plant and putting them into a salad. Or they make excellent fritters, and in my book I've got a recipe for black locust fritters. This is your ox-eye daisy, your standard she loves me not daisy. The best edible part are the leaves before the flowers come out. They're really good. They have a sweet, kind of a radishy flavor, so I've never bothered to cook with them. I just use them in salads because they're really good. This plant I'm sure grows in Newton. In fact, a lot of landscapers use it. This is called Juneberry, or shadbush serviceberry, genus Amelanchier. And it's called Juneberry because the fruit's ripe near the end of June. And those purple berries on there are the ripe ones. And they look a lot like blueberries, but they don't taste at all like blueberries. They taste like a cross between cherries and almonds. So they're really good. It's good for stuffing your face right by the tree, or for making pies or muffins, or you could dry the fruit and make granola. You can add them to granola. They're good that way. So in my book, I've got a couple recipes for Juneberries. Mulberries are great. There are mulberries in Newton. The way you probably often encounter them is you'll be walking or riding your bike along, and all of a sudden you'll see this area, the sidewalk of the pavement, that's stained purple. And then you look up and you see where all the mulberries have been dropping on the pavement. So mulberries vary quite a lot in flavor from tree to tree. Sometimes they're kind of insipid, which means they're sweet without any tartness. But occasionally you'll find one where it's really sweet and really tart and just really excellent fruit. And then you can use it most ways you'd use a blackberry or raspberry. Yeah, the white ones tend to be insipid. White ones tend to not have the tang of the red ones. But they're perfectly edible, and if you mix them with other fruits, it doesn't matter. Okay, so anybody know what this is? Anybody have a house in the Cape, or the Vineyard, or Buzzards Bay, or spend any time along Long Island Sound, or the lower Hudson Valley? Because that's where this plant grows. This is called a wineberry. And it is in the same genus as the raspberry, genus rubus, but it's Rubus foediculaceus is the botanical name. And it is, unfortunately, in that invasive species book I showed you at the beginning, so the ecologists are concerned about it. It's really pretty, and it's very tasty. And this is one that's ripe around the end of July. So if you do find yourself around Buzzards Bay, Cape and Islands, Long Island Sound, so on, around the end of July, look for this fruit. And besides tasting good, it's great to use in any recipe where you can show the fruit off. This is actually a wineberry flan that my wife made from berries we had frozen and used 9 months later. And look how well they still hold up. This plant is growing right in front of the library. This is jewelweed, and a lot of people know this plant because it's an antidote to poison ivy, and it has been clinically proven to work for some people. And you just take the plant and scrunch it up and rub it on the place where you either have poison ivy or where you think you're exposed to poison ivy. It's edible too, and the edible part are the ripe seeds. And if you see the things hanging down there, those are the seed pods, and the ripe seeds are in there. But the trick is gathering them, because when the seeds are ripe, they explode. I mean, the seed pods explode. So one of the nicknames for this plant is touch-me-not, because if you brush against the plant when the seed pods are ripe, they just go what you need to do if you want to eat one of the seeds is you have to sneak up on one of those ripe seed pods and grab it and have it explode in your hand. Don't worry, it won't hurt. When you open up your hand, you'll see these little football-shaped things. Those are the ripe seeds. If you eat them, you find they taste just like walnuts. Purslane, this one's pretty much finished for the year, but this is a real hot weather weed. Loves to grow in fertile soil, so very common in just about any vegetable garden or farm. And it's very good for you, and it's tasty. By the way, the botanical name for this plant is portulaca. That's the genus, so it's related to garden portulaca. And the species name is Oleracea, which means good enough to be a garden vegetable. And it is. So you can eat it plain. You can cook with it. One easy and good way to use it is you can just pick the leaves and the tender part off and throw them into a gazpacho. Any gazpacho that you make yourself or buy at the store. And the texture of the purslane leaves work really, really well in a gazpacho. And purslane is very high in vitamins, especially iron and omega-3 fatty acids. It's a very healthful plant to eat too. This is elderberry, and this plant, the fruit looked like this just a few weeks ago. It's pretty much gone by now. This photo is not upside down. That's what the elderberry clusters typically do when they're ripe, is the weight of the fruit makes that berry cluster hang upside down. So that when they bloom like that, but the weight of the clusters makes them hang upside down. And elderberries aren't good raw. You have to dry them first or cook them first, and then you can eat them. What I typically do is just dry all the berries I pick in my food dehydrator, and then I just store them in a glass jar in my pantry, and they'll keep indefinitely till you're ready to use them, and then I'll rehydrate them in some hot apple cider before I use them. Spice bush berries, you should be able to find these in Newton, and you want to look for a swampy area that's forested and look near a stream, and you may still be able to find some of the berries on the plant, and that's the part that I use. I pick the red berries off and I dry them, and you don't need a food dehydrator, just spread them out in a plate or a cookie sheet and they'll dry. And unfortunately, they lose that beautiful scarlet color. They turn kind of a reddish-brown color, and they get wrinkly. But once they're fully dried, you can store them in a glass jar and keep them in your pantry till you're ready to use them. And then you just grind them up in a little mortar and pestle. And what it is, it makes a savory spice, not a sweet spice like allspice, like most of the foraging books tell you. It's actually a savory spice that you use like for a casserole or an omelet or soup, something like that. Black cherries, this year was a really good year for black cherries. They're everywhere. And black cherries, though, they also vary in flavor from tree to tree. Sometimes they're really astringent and not very good at all. And other times they're really sweet and just about as good as a domesticated cherry, except that they're small. They might get to be just about a ½ inch in diameter, but that's absolutely as big as they get. What's this plant? This basically is illustrating that sometimes plants, when they're out of season, are more visible than they're in season. So a tree that's blooming like this, you can see from quite a ways off. This is a beach plum. That's what beach plums look like when they're blooming. So this is what the beach plums looked like just a few weeks ago up on Plum Island, which is named after beach plums, if you didn't know that before. And Cape Cod, of course, and other places along the coast. Although beach plums will occasionally grow inland. I know a spot in Worcester County where beach plums grow. Beach plums also, it's like cherries. Sometimes they're really sour and astringent, and sometimes they are amazingly good. Just about as good as any plum you grow yourself or buy from a produce or farmer's market. They are small, though. They get to be 3/4 inch in diameter. That's as big as they get. This shot I took in Worcester County. That's how many I found a few years back. Actually, roses are edible, not just the wild ones, but any rose, whether it's domesticated or wild, is edible. And the two edible parts are the rose petals and the rose hip. And a rose hip is just the fruit of any rose, wild or domesticated. So this is the Rosa rugosa plant, which is a good one for foraging because it's really big. You've got big petals, big rose hips, so that's good. And then this is the dog rose, which I also see in Massachusetts, and this one is kind of medium-sized. It's still big enough. These rose hips are probably about 1.25 inches, 1.5 inches long, so they're still big enough to use. These make rose hip tea, fresh or dried, or rose hip jam, which is almost like an apple butter, and that's very good. The rose petals you can use fresh to decorate things like cakes or salads. You can candy them. You can make a rose water out of them, which is used a lot in Middle Eastern cooking. Beach peas are edible. Although they're confined to the coast, I've never found beach peas inland. You need to be right along the edge of the salt water to get them. Here's my wife shelling a bunch of beach peas, and that's what they look like inside. And it's fun to harvest them and eat them, but if you grow peas at home, there's no real need to harvest beach peas at the beach. But if you're at the beach anyway, I think it's funner. If there's beach peas there to harvest, it's funner to be harvesting them than sitting around in a towel getting skin cancer. So this is, what I'd rather do. Okay, now while we're on the ocean, there's wonderfully edible seaweeds, and here's one. This is called dulse, which looks like a flat maroon hand when you find it in the ocean attached to a rock or just floating around. And it's not edible raw. The texture's like plastic. But when you dry it, it retains a very flexible texture, and it turns this beautiful purpley color, and it's delicious. Just chewing on it, it's got this wonderful briny flavor. It's loaded with vitamins and trace minerals like most seaweeds are. So it's one of my favorite ones to eat. This is the Irish moss, which you've probably all eaten this one too, although not in this form. You've probably all eaten processed food products containing a chemical called carrageen or carrageenan, which is derived from Irish moss. So sometimes people find the Irish moss bleached up on the beach, and you can also use it like this. And basically it's used to extract the gelatinous material to make puddings. Something called blancmange is made with the Irish moss. Wild grapes, I brought some wild grapes in the back, so if you didn't smell them already, you can go and taste them at the end. Grapes and hazelnuts are ripe at the same time, so I'm often harvesting them on the same foraging trip because they often like a similar habitat. And so grapes are great for stuffing your face right by the vine. Okay, this is a sumac, and by the way, any sumac with tight upright clusters of red berries is not poison sumac. So if you've been fearing this plant, there's absolutely nothing to fear about it. In fact, it's edible, and one of the edible parts are these berries. It's actually an acid you collect off the berries, and you make a drink from it, and I describe it in my book, and it's very easy to do. This is a cranberry. This is what cranberries look like when they're blooming. In fact, the original name for cranberries was craneberry because these little flowers look like little cranes. This photo was taken in Central Mass. It was actually taken as part of your water system. As you know, Newton is supplied by the MWRA, and so your water comes from the Quabbin and the Wachusett Reservoir, and it so happens that the edges of the Wachusett Reservoir are filled with millions of cranberry plants and cranberries. So, and this is the time of year to go out there. Any time between now and like November is the time of year to go out to Wachusett Reservoir, and you're allowed to do this, by the way, and go pick cranberries. This is the mountain cranberry, which is otherwise known as the lingonberry. So you might have heard Scandinavians, they're very proud of the lingonberries. Well, we have them too. It's a circumboreal species, so once you get above a certain latitude, they kick in. So my wife and I climbed Mount Monadnock last weekend. There's some there on Mount Cardigan. There is some, once you go in down East Maine, you can find them right along the coast, and it's basically the same flavor. This is a photo that's the same as the photo on your handout about eating acorns, and I just put this in to show you the difference between what I call the hard oaks and the soft oaks. So the leaf on the right, that is a hard oak with the really pointy lobes. The leaves on the left, that's the soft oak with the rounded lobes. So it's the acorns from the soft oak species like white oak, swamp white oak, post oak, chestnut oak, bur oak. Those are the ones with less tannic acid in them, so they're more palatable than the hard oak acorns. Hickory nuts, they're just coming into season in about a week or so. I'm a little worried about how dry it's been that we won't have a good crop this year, but ordinarily I'm picking hundreds of those every year. And one good way to make them is to mix them with maple stuff, like these are maple hickory nut pralines. It's really good. And in my book I've got a recipe for maple hickory nut pie, which is like a pecan pie, like the New England version of pecan pie. Black walnuts, this is what they look like on the tree, and I used to see them in my neighborhood in Cambridge. I used to live in an area that had it was near a Star Market, and there were black walnut trees that would drop the nuts right on the pavement, and then the cars would run over the nuts and get those nasty green husks off, so I could just pick the dehusked nuts right out of the parking lot, which saves a lot of labor, because that's the first challenge, is to get that green husk off. And then once you get that off, you got to crack the nut open, which is also some work because you can't use a conventional nut cracker. You have to use a really sturdy thing like a hammer. And once you got them open, then black walnuts are great. They're really good in recipes where you can let the very strong assertive flavor of the black walnuts come to the foreground. Like, for example, so anyway, this is a recipe I gave you. This is black walnut baklava. And black walnuts are not ripe yet, so if you wait just a few weeks, they'll start to fall on the ground, and then you don't have to pick them off the tree. Wait till they hit the ground, and that's one of the ways you can use them. It's really good. This is ground nut, and it has an edible part. It isn't really a nut, it's a tuber, so it's like a little potato thing. And these grow underneath the ground, and one way to eat them is you just slice them crosswise and fry them in a little oil till they're golden and make groundnut chips. This is my wife Ellen smelling some blooming autumn olive shrubs. So that's what they look like in the spring, and they have a nice pleasant smell. And then this is what I made that fruit leather from. By the way, I added nothing to that fruit leather. No sugar, no lemon juice. It's just 100% wild fruit pulp. That's it.
What's it called?
Autumn olive. And besides tasting good, it's got vitamin C in it, and the USDA did a study a few years back on the autumn olive fruit pulp, and they determined that it's up to 18 times higher in lycopene content than tomatoes. So it's really good for you. This photo documents the results of a very successful foraging day I had a few years back on a Columbus Day. And let me quickly run through what's in the photo here. So in the lower right-hand corner, there's some wild pears that I picked. And then you see some hickory nuts over to the left there. Some autumn olives in the center. And then the mushrooms are a combination of porcinis, and then the big ones with the brown gills, those are the Agaricus arvensis, the horse mushroom, which are really good. You're probably wondering what the barbecue grill is doing in the back of the photo. Well, I needed one of those too, and somebody had put one out with their trash, so I foraged for that while I was gathering everything else that way. So it's a very productive day. Okay, this is a plant called barberry, and this is not the Japanese barberry, which is a really hated invasive. This is a less hated invasive called the European barberry, the common barberry. And you see the flowers hang down in clusters, and the berries hang down in clusters too. So I make a jelly from this. And one time I accidentally made wine from it, which is really good. But I can't give you a recipe because I did it by accident. But here's one good way to use the barberries in the thumbprint cookies, where I'm using the chopped hickory nuts on the outside and the barberry jelly in the center. And these are really good. Jerusalem artichoke, it looks like this right now. The plant's blooming and it looks just like that right now. It's a tuber-bearing cousin of the sunflower. And that's what the tubers look like. So this is a winter foraging opportunity. Anytime the ground isn't frozen, you can dig out the base of those plants and pull up these tubers. And you can use them most ways you use a potato. You can bake them, boil them, mash them, roast them, and so on. This is the high bush cranberry, which is actually not related to the regular cranberry. It's a species of viburnum. It's growing here at the library. I don't know if you have the tasty one, because there is a Swedish cousin of this plant that tastes horrible. It's not poisonous, it just tastes really horrible. It's opulum, viburnum opulum. This is viburnum trilobum or americanum. And this one, the berries also persist on the plants over the winter, so you can find this one in a cross-country skiing expedition. Every once in a while, which is getting to be like only every other year now, my wife and I have the strength. We spend several months gathering and preparing and cooking several dozen dishes, all from wild ingredients. Desserts, appetizers, drinks, and you name it. And then we invite all our friends over to chow down. So that's the show. Thanks a lot.